During our walk, my girlfriend grabbed my jacket and stepped back, pointing at the torn fabric. "Tell me that's not blood." My hands went cold. Then I saw. 21 days later, my mother read the police report and collapsed. Alicia's fingers were trembling when she touched the rip in my North Face jacket, right along the left shoulder seam. The fabric was shredded like something had clawed through it, and there, unmistakable even in the fading evening light of Riverside Park, were dark, rust-colored stains soaked into the navy material. Her face had gone white, eyes locked on the damage like she was seeing something obscene. I looked down at my own shoulder, felt the torn fabric under my fingertips, and my stomach dropped through the pavement. The blood wasn't fresh, maybe a day old, dried and stiff against the waterproof shell. I had no memory of tearing my jacket, no memory of bleeding, no memory of anything that could explain why I was wearing evidence of violence I couldn't recall committing or experiencing. Alicia stepped back another foot, her hand covering her mouth, and asked in a voice I'd never heard from her before, small and frightened, if I was hurt. I pulled the jacket off with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and checked my shoulder, my arms, my torso. No cuts, no bruises, no pain. The blood wasn't mine. I'd been dating Alicia for 8 months when the incident with the jacket happened. We met at a photography exhibition downtown where she was showing her work, haunting black and white portraits of strangers she'd approached on the street and convinced to sit for her. I was there because my coworker dragged me along, insisting I needed to do something cultural instead of spending another Friday night reviewing code for the software company where I worked as a senior developer. Alicia and I started talking about composition and lighting and somehow ended up at a diner at midnight, still deep in conversation. She was 29, a freelance photographer trying to make it in a city that ate artists alive. I was 31, stable job, stable life, stable everything. She brought chaos and color into my carefully organized existence, and I'd fallen for her methodically and completely. The walk through Riverside Park had been her idea, a Sunday evening tradition we'd developed over the past few months. She'd bring her camera, I'd bring coffee from the place on Amsterdam Avenue, and we'd wander the paths watching the sunset paint the Hudson River in shades of gold and crimson. That particular Sunday in October had been unseasonably warm, mid-60s and clear, and Alicia had been in a good mood, laughing at something her sister had texted her. I'd been distracted, my mind half on a project deadline coming up that week, barely paying attention to where we were walking. When she grabbed my jacket and froze, I'd been mid-sentence about some technical problem I was trying to solve. Her interruption cut through my thoughts like a knife. Standing there holding my blood-stained torn jacket while Alicia stared at me with growing horror, I tried to reconstruct the past 24 hours. Saturday night, I'd stayed home, ordered Thai food, worked on code until around midnight, then gone to bed. Sunday morning, I'd woken up at 8, made coffee, answered some emails, met Alicia at noon for brunch. We'd spent the afternoon at her apartment looking through her portfolio. I'd been wearing this jacket the entire time. How had I not noticed a massive rip and bloodstains? The jacket was dark navy, the blood was dark rust, but still. The tear was significant. The fabric pulled apart in 3 distinct claw-like marks. Alicia asked again if I was sure I wasn't hurt, and I assured her I was fine. She asked if I remembered anything from last night that could explain this, and I said no, nothing, everything was normal. Her expression shifted then, from frightened to something else. Suspicious maybe, or calculating. She asked if I'd been drinking last night, and I said no, just worked and went to bed. She asked if I was absolutely certain, if there was any gap in my memory, any time I couldn't account for. The question landed strange, like she was interrogating me instead of helping me figure out what happened. I told her I was certain. I'd been home alone all night. There was nothing to explain this. She nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. She suggested we go back to my apartment, and I should check everything carefully. Maybe I'd hurt myself and forgotten. Maybe the jacket got damaged some other way. Her tone was soothing, but her eyes were scanning me like she was looking for lies. We walked back to my apartment in silence. I lived in a 1-bedroom on West 86th Street, 4th floor walk-up, small but clean and organized the way I liked everything. Alicia had always teased me about my compulsive tidiness, the way I arranged my books by genre and size, the way my kitchen was color-coded and labeled. Walking into my apartment that evening, I saw it all with new eyes, looking for anything out of place. Everything looked normal, exactly as I'd left it that morning. Alicia went through each room methodically with her photographer's eye for detail, checking for signs of a struggle or injury or anything unusual. She found nothing. My bed was made, my dishes were clean and put away. My trash can held only the Thai food containers from Saturday night. There was no evidence that anything violent had occurred in my space. I checked my phone for clues, scrolling through texts and calls from the past 24 hours. Nothing unusual. A few work emails. Text exchange with Alicia about brunch plans. A call from my mother Saturday afternoon that lasted 6 minutes. Just her usual weekend check-in, asking how I was doing and reminding me about a family dinner next month. I showed Alicia my phone timeline, proving I'd been exactly where I said I'd been. She looked at it and nodded, but something in her expression remained troubled. She asked if she could take photos of the jacket, said we should document this before I tried to clean it or threw it away. I asked why we'd need documentation, and she said quietly that if something happened I didn't remember, If someone hurt me or I hurt someone, we'd want evidence. The possibility that I might have hurt someone landed like ice water in my veins. Alicia photographed the jacket from multiple angles, close-ups of the torn fabric and the bloodstains, wider shots showing the size and location of the damage. Her hands were steady with the camera in a way they hadn't been when she first grabbed my jacket. This was her element, documenting reality through a lens. She asked if I wanted her to stay over that night, and I said yes immediately, suddenly afraid to be alone with the gap in my understanding. We ordered dinner, but neither of us ate much. We tried to watch a movie, but I couldn't focus on the screen. Around 11, Alicia went to bed, and I stayed up checking my apartment again, looking for anything I'd missed. I found nothing. At 2:30 in the morning, I finally gave up and went to bed, but sleep was impossible. I lay awake staring at the ceiling trying to remember Saturday night in perfect detail, searching for any moment that felt fuzzy or incomplete. There was nothing. Just me, my apartment, my work, and sleep. Normal. Unremarkable. Impossible to reconcile with a blood-stained, torn jacket. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and made an appointment with my doctor. Dr. Priya Anand had been my primary care physician for 3 years, a sharp woman in her early 40s who'd gone to medical school at Columbia and had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. I trusted her completely. I showed up at her office at 10:15 and explained the situation in clinical terms. Found blood on my jacket. No memory of injury or incident. Need to rule out medical causes for memory loss. She listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, asked detailed questions about my sleep patterns, stress levels, medication use, alcohol consumption, and any recent head injuries. I answered everything honestly. No changes to my routine, no new medications, barely drink, no head trauma I could remember. Dr. Anand examined me carefully, checking for injuries I might have missed, looking for signs of neurological issues, testing my reflexes and cognitive function. Everything came back normal. She ordered a full blood panel to check for toxicology issues and scheduled me for a CT scan that afternoon to rule out brain trauma that might explain memory gaps. She asked if I'd kept the jacket, and I said yes. Alicia had documented it photographically. Dr. Anand suggested I also keep the physical evidence in case we needed to test the blood, determine if it was human, and if so, whose. The casual way she said this, like it was standard medical advice, made my hands go numb. I asked if she thought I'd hurt someone, and she said she didn't know, but unexplained blood and memory loss warranted investigation. She wrote me a referral for a neurologist and told me to come back Wednesday for the blood work results. The CT scan that afternoon showed nothing abnormal. No tumors, no bleeding, no structural damage that would explain memory gaps or behavioral changes. I went home with more questions than answers and found Alicia waiting in my apartment. She'd used the spare key I'd given her last month and let herself in, made coffee, was sitting at my kitchen table with her laptop open. She looked up when I entered, and I could see she'd been crying. She asked what the doctor said, and I explained the tests, the normal results, the referral to a neurologist. She nodded and said she'd been doing research, looking up causes of memory loss and unexplained violence. She'd found articles about dissociative episodes, about sleepwalking violence, about drug-facilitated amnesia. Each possibility felt more terrifying than the last. Alicia asked if I'd consider going to the police, filing a report about the jacket even though we didn't know what had happened. I asked what we'd tell them, and she said exactly what we knew. I'd found blood and damage on my clothing with no memory of the cause. Maybe someone had attacked me. Maybe I'd witnessed something. Maybe there was a crime that needed investigating. I resisted initially because going to the police meant making this real and official and permanent. But Alicia insisted with a gentleness that made it worse. She said if something had happened to me, I deserved answers. If something had happened because of me, people deserve protection. Either way, staying silent felt like complicity. We went to the precinct on West 82nd Street on Monday evening. The desk sergeant was a tired-looking woman in her 50s, who'd clearly seen everything and was impressed by nothing. I explained the situation haltingly, aware of how insane it sounded. Found blood on my jacket. Can't remember how it got there. Want to report it in case it's connected to a crime. She looked at me with the particular expression cops reserve for time wasters and crazies, then asked if I was reporting an assault or confessing to one. I said neither. I honestly didn't know what I was reporting. She sighed and called over Detective Raymond Cole, who'd been working in the precinct for 19 years and had the weathered face to prove it. Detective Cole listened to my story with more patience than the sergeant had shown, taking notes in a battered notebook while I explained about the jacket, the blood, the memory gap, the medical tests. He asked to see the jacket, and Alicia pulled up the photos on her phone. Cole studied them carefully, zooming in on the tears and stains, his expression unreadable. He asked if I'd brought the physical jacket, and I said yes. It was in the bag I was carrying. He took it carefully, told me he'd log it as evidence, and send it to the lab for analysis. He said it would take about 2 weeks to get results on the blood type and DNA, longer if they needed to run it through databases. He asked if I'd consent to giving a DNA sample for comparison, and I said yes immediately. He swabbed the inside of my cheek and labeled the sample with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing this thousands of times. Detective Cole asked about my movements on Saturday night, and I walked him through everything again. Stayed home, ordered food, worked, slept. He asked if anyone could corroborate that, and I said no, I lived alone. He asked if my building had security cameras, and I said yes, in the lobby and at the entrance. He made a note to request the footage. He asked about my relationship with Alicia, how long we'd been together, if there were any issues. Alicia answered that we'd been dating 8 months and everything was fine. She was here supporting me, not accusing me. Cole nodded and wrote something I couldn't see. He asked if I had any enemies, anyone who might want to harm me or frame me for something. I said no. I was a software developer. My life was boring. I had no drama with anyone. The detective said he'd open an investigation file and follow up when the lab results came back. He warned me that if the blood matched a victim of a violent crime, I'd be brought in for further questioning regardless of my memory gaps. He said memory loss wasn't a legal defense, and I should probably consult with an attorney just in case. The casual way he suggested I might need legal representation made my chest tight. I asked if he thought I'd hurt someone, and he said he didn't know yet, but unexplained blood evidence required serious investigation. He gave me his card and told me not to leave the city without notifying him first. Walking out of that precinct felt like crossing a threshold into a reality I didn't recognize. The next 2 weeks were a special kind of torture. I went back to work, but couldn't concentrate. My coworkers noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay. I said I was fine, just dealing with some personal stuff, and tried to act normal. Alicia checked in constantly, texting throughout the day, staying over most nights. Her presence was comforting, but also reminded me that something was fundamentally wrong with my life. Dr. Anand called Wednesday with my blood work results. Everything came back normal. No drugs in my system, no toxins, no alcohol, nothing that would explain memory loss or behavioral changes. She said the neurologist could do more extensive testing, but based on everything so far, I was physically healthy, which meant the problem was something else entirely. I started having nightmares on day 8, vivid, violent dreams where I was hurting people I didn't recognize, my hands covered in blood, faceless victims screaming. I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning drenched in sweat, heart racing, Alicia shaking me awake because I'd been yelling in my sleep. She asked what I was dreaming about, and I couldn't tell her the details, couldn't admit I was dreaming about being a killer. I started being afraid to sleep, staying up until exhaustion forced unconsciousness. The lack of sleep made everything worse, made reality feel unsteady and unreliable. I started questioning everything. Had I really stayed home Saturday night? Was my memory actually intact, or was I lying to myself? On day 12, my mother called. She did her usual routine of asking about work and Alicia and whether I was eating properly. I almost told her about the jacket and the police investigation, but something stopped me. My mother was 63, widowed since my father died 6 years ago, prone to worry and anxiety about my well-being. Loading her with this information felt cruel when I didn't even know what it meant yet. So I lied and said everything was fine, and she seemed satisfied with my performance. After we hung up, I felt sick about the deception. My relationship with my mother had always been built on honesty, and here I was hiding something massive from her. But what was I supposed to say? "Hey, Mom, I found blood on my jacket and can't remember where it came from. The police are investigating me for possible violent crime." The conversation would destroy her. Detective Cole called on day 14. His voice was carefully neutral when he said the lab results were back, and he needed me to come to the precinct for a follow-up interview. I asked if the blood had been identified, and he said yes, but he'd prefer to discuss it in person. I asked if I needed an attorney, and he said that was my right, but I wasn't being charged with anything currently. The word currently hung in the air like a threat. I called Alicia and told her about the summons. She said she was coming with me, and I didn't argue. Having her there felt necessary, like she was the only thing anchoring me to reality. We arrived at the precinct at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. Detective Cole met us in the lobby and led us to an interview room that smelled like old coffee and desperation. The room had a metal table, 4 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. Cole sat across from us and opened a folder, pulling out a lab report that he slid across the table. The blood on my jacket was human, type O negative, male. DNA analysis had been run through criminal databases and come back with a match. My stomach dropped before Cole even said the name. The blood belonged to a man named Julian Voss, who'd been reported missing by his wife on Sunday morning, October 15th. The same day Alicia had found my jacket. I stared at the name on the report and felt reality tilt. Julian Voss meant nothing to me. I'd never heard that name in my life, had no connection to anyone named Julian or Voss or any combination thereof. I told Detective Cole this, and he nodded like he'd expected that answer. He pulled out another document, this one a missing person report with a photo attached. Julian Voss was 43 years old, worked in finance, lived on the Upper West Side about 16 blocks from my apartment. He'd left his home Saturday evening around 10 p.m. to walk their dog and never returned. The dog, a golden retriever named Bailey, had been found Sunday morning wandering near Riverside Park, still on his leash. Julian was still missing. Foul play was suspected. Detective Cole asked where I was Saturday night between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. I said I was home in bed by midnight, but I lived alone and had no way to prove it. He asked if I knew Julian Voss or his wife, or had any connection to them whatsoever. I said no, absolutely not. I'd never heard of them before this moment. He asked how my jacket had ended up covered in Julian's blood. I said I had no idea. I didn't remember being near anyone who was bleeding. I didn't remember any kind of altercation or incident. Cole studied me silently for a long moment, then said the blood pattern on my jacket was consistent with arterial spray, which meant Julian had been bleeding heavily when I was near him. Either I'd witnessed his injury or I'd caused it. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in. Alicia's hand found mine under the table and squeezed hard. I asked if there was any other evidence linking me to Julian's disappearance, and Cole said the investigation was ongoing. They'd requested security footage from my building, were canvassing Riverside Park for witnesses, and were looking into any connections between me and the victim. He said I was currently a person of interest in Julian Voss's disappearance and potential homicide. He asked if I'd be willing to answer more questions, and I said yes. I wanted to help. I wanted to understand what happened. He asked if I'd take a polygraph test, and I hesitated, looked at Alicia. She whispered that I should probably get a lawyer before agreeing to anything else. I told Detective Cole I'd consult with an attorney and get back to him. He nodded like he'd expected that too, handed me another card, and said I shouldn't leave the city. Walking out of that interview room felt like walking through quicksand. My legs barely worked. Alicia had to support my weight as we made it to the street. She called an attorney her father had used for business litigation, a man named Russell Grant, who'd been practicing criminal defense for 26 years. Grant's office was in Midtown, and he agreed to see us that evening. We took the subway in silence, both processing the impossibility of the situation. I was a suspect in a missing person case for someone I'd never met, covered in his blood with no memory of how it got there. Russell Grant looked like Central Casting's version of a defense attorney. Silver hair, expensive suit, confident demeanor that suggested he'd seen worse and won. He listened to our story without interrupting, took detailed notes, and asked sharp questions about timelines and evidence and what exactly Detective Cole had said. When we finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and said bluntly that I was in serious trouble. The blood evidence was damning, my lack of alibi was problematic, and my memory gap would be portrayed as convenient rather than genuine. He said the police would be building a case against me, and I needed to prepare for the possibility of arrest. I asked what my options were, and he said we needed to figure out what actually happened Saturday night. Either I was involved in blocking out the trauma, or someone was framing me, or there was a third explanation we hadn't considered yet. Grant said he'd hire a private investigator to look into Julian Voss's life and movements, check for anyone who might want to harm him or frame someone else for his disappearance. He'd also get copies of my building's security footage to verify my alibi as much as possible. He warned me not to speak to police again without him present, not to discuss the case with anyone except Alicia and him, and to document everything I remembered about Saturday night, no matter how insignificant it seemed. The consultation cost $5,000 just for the retainer, and I paid it with a credit card while Alicia watched silently. Walking out of that office, I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare and couldn't find the exit. The private investigator Grant hired was a woman named Corinne Rao, who'd spent 15 years with the NYPD before going private. She was methodical and thorough, interviewing me for 3 hours about Saturday night, about my routines, about my relationship with Alicia, about anything that might be relevant. She requested access to my phone and laptop to check my digital footprint from that night. She said she'd canvass my neighborhood and Riverside Park looking for witnesses or surveillance cameras the police might have missed. She asked if I'd be willing to undergo hypnosis to try to recover blocked memories, and I said yes, anything that might help. She said she'd arrange it with a forensic psychologist she trusted. The hypnosis session happened on day 17. Dr. Nathan Cross was a clinical psychologist with 23 years of experience in trauma and memory recovery. His office was in a brownstone on the Upper East Side, quiet and dimly lit with comfortable furniture designed to put people at ease. He explained that hypnosis wasn't like the movies, wouldn't make me do anything against my will, just might help me access memories my conscious mind was suppressing. I lay back on a couch while he walked me through relaxation techniques, counting backward, focusing on my breathing. His voice was calm and steady as he guided me back to Saturday night, asking me to visualize my apartment, my activities, the progression of the evening. Under hypnosis, I remembered working on code until my eyes hurt, ordering Thai food from the place on Broadway, eating while watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures. I remembered checking my phone around 11:30, brushing my teeth, setting my alarm for 8 a.m. I remembered getting into bed and closing my eyes. Then nothing. Dr. Cross asked what happened after I closed my eyes, if I woke up at any point during the night. I said no. I slept straight through until morning. He asked if I was certain, if there might be any gap I wasn't aware of. I started to say no again. Then something shifted. A memory that felt wrong, like watching someone else's dream. Walking through Riverside Park in darkness. The smell of wet leaves and river water. A dog barking somewhere close by. A man's voice calling out a name. Bailey. The dog's name was Bailey. Dr. Cross asked what happened next, and the memory fractured, became confused and terrifying. Running. Someone running toward me or away from me or both. Sounds of struggle, of impact, of something wet and terrible. A dog howling in distress. My hands reaching out for something or someone. Then nothing again. Just blackness, and the sense of waking up in my bed Sunday morning with no memory of leaving it. Dr. Cross brought me back to full consciousness slowly, carefully. I opened my eyes and immediately started crying because the memory felt real, but impossible. I told him what I'd seen, and he said recovered memories under hypnosis weren't always reliable as evidence, could be influenced by suggestion, or trauma, or fear. But he'd record the session, and we could review it later to see if anything I'd said provided useful leads. I left Dr. Cross's office feeling worse than when I'd arrived. The memory, if it was real, suggested I had been in Riverside Park Saturday night, that I'd encountered Julian Voss and his dog, that something violent had happened. But I still had no memory of leaving my apartment or returning to it, no explanation for how I could have been in two places at once. Alicia picked me up from the session, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, holding my hand while we sat in her parked car. Finally, she asked if I thought the memory was real. I said I didn't know. It felt real, but also felt like a nightmare, like something my brain might have constructed from fear and suggestion. She asked if I thought I'd hurt Julian Voss. I looked at her and said honestly that I didn't know any more what I was capable of. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept replaying the hypnosis memory, trying to determine if it was genuine or fabricated. Alicia had gone home to get some work done, and I was alone in my apartment staring at the ceiling. Around 2 a.m., I got up and started going through my things systematically, looking for anything else that might be out of place or wrong. I checked my clothes, my shoes, my jacket pockets. In the inside pocket of my torn jacket, which police had returned after processing it, I found something I'd missed before. A small slip of paper, folded twice, with writing on it. The handwriting wasn't mine. It said, Riverside Park, midnight, come alone. No signature, no context, just those 5 words that made my blood run cold. I called Russell Grant immediately despite the hour. He answered sounding alert, like he'd been awake. I told him about the note, and he said to bag it carefully and bring it to his office first thing in the morning. He said this could be evidence of a setup, proof that someone had lured me to the park, or it could be evidence of premeditation if I'd written it myself and forgotten. Either way, it needed to be analyzed. I barely slept the remaining hours until dawn, then met Grant at his office at 7 a.m. He examined the note carefully, photographed it, and sent it to a forensic document examiner he worked with regularly. He said we'd have results on the handwriting within 48 hours. The handwriting analysis came back on day 19. The expert, a woman named Dr. Melissa Trent, with 30 years of experience in forensic document examination, concluded that the handwriting was not mine. She'd compared it to samples of my writing from various sources and found no match in style, pressure, or formation. The note had been written by someone else. Grant said this was good news, suggested someone had deliberately lured me to the park, possibly drugged me to create memory loss, and framed me for whatever happened to Julian Voss. But we still needed to prove who and why. Corinne Rao, the private investigator, had been digging into Julian's life and found some interesting patterns. Julian Voss worked for a hedge fund and had recently testified against a colleague in a securities fraud case. The colleague, a man named David Fenton, had been convicted 3 months ago and was currently serving 5 years in federal prison. Fenton had made threats against Julian during the trial, vowing revenge for his cooperation with prosecutors. Corinne said Fenton had connections to people who might be capable of orchestrating an elaborate frame job. She was trying to trace Fenton's communications from prison to see if he'd arranged something against Julian. She'd also found surveillance footage from a bodega 3 blocks from my apartment, showing someone who looked like me walking toward Riverside Park at 11:52 p.m. Saturday night. The footage was grainy, but the clothing and build matched. I watched the footage in Russell Grant's office and felt sick. That was definitely me walking toward the park. But I had no memory of leaving my apartment, of walking those 3 blocks, of anything after getting into bed around 11:30. Grant said the gap between my last conscious memory and the surveillance footage was only about 20 minutes, which suggested I'd either been sleepwalking or had been drugged very recently before leaving. He recommended I get toxicology testing done for substances that might have metabolized out of my system by the time Dr. Annan drew my blood. There were drugs that could cause temporary amnesia and could be undetectable after 72 hours. I agreed immediately, and he arranged for me to see a specialist in drug-facilitated crimes. Dr. Linda Kowalski ran a private lab that specialized in detecting trace amounts of substances used in date rape and drugging cases. She'd testified in over 200 criminal trials as an expert witness. She took new blood and hair samples from me, explaining that hair could show drug use going back several months. She said she'd test for a comprehensive panel including benzodiazepines, rohypnol, GHB, scopolamine, and several other substances known to cause amnesia. The results would take about a week. I left her lab feeling a mixture of hope and dread. If she found something, it would explain my memory loss, but raise terrifying questions about who had drugged me and how. Day 20 brought the news that changed everything. Detective Cole called Russell Grant's office requesting another interview with me. Grant negotiated the terms. We'd come in voluntarily, but he'd be present for all questioning, and anything I said would be preliminary and not binding. We arrived at the precinct at 3 p.m. Cole met us with a different energy, less suspicious and more confused. He said they'd found Julian Voss, alive, wandering in a confused state near the New Jersey border, approximately 90 miles from where he'd disappeared. Julian had been taken to a hospital and was being evaluated, but he was physically unharmed except for defensive wounds on his hands and arms. The blood on my jacket was from those defensive wounds. I asked what Julian remembered, and Cole said that was the strange part. Julian's memory of Saturday night was completely gone. The last thing he remembered was leaving his apartment to walk his dog around 10 p.m. His next memory was waking up on a roadside in New Jersey with no idea how he'd gotten there. Police were investigating his case as a possible kidnapping or drugging incident. Cole said they were still treating my involvement as suspicious because my jacket had Julian's blood on it, and I'd been seen walking toward Riverside Park around the time Julian went missing. But with Julian alive and unable to identify me as his attacker, the case against me had weakened significantly. Cole asked if I'd be willing to meet with Julian to see if seeing me triggered any memories. Russell Grant said absolutely not. That was a terrible idea that could be construed as witness tampering. Cole backed off but said the investigation was ongoing and I was still a person of interest. After we left the precinct, Grant said this new development changed the entire framework of the case. Two people with no connection to each other had both lost memory of the same night and both ended up involved in a violent incident. That suggested a third party orchestrating something. He said we needed to find the connection between me and Julian, figure out who would benefit from both of us being compromised. Corinne Rao was already looking into it. The answer came on day 21. Corinne called Grant's office with information that made everything click into place. She'd been digging into both my background and Julian's, looking for any overlap. She'd found it in an unlikely place. We'd both been patients of the same psychiatrist 8 years ago. Dr. Andrew Marsh had treated me briefly for work-related anxiety when I first moved to New York. He'd treated Julian for depression following a divorce. Dr. Marsh had lost his medical license 4 years ago following allegations of unethical treatment practices and improper prescription of controlled substances. He'd appealed the decision and lost. Corinne had tracked down 3 other former patients of Dr. Marsh who'd reported similar experiences, memory gaps, finding themselves in strange locations, evidence of activities they didn't remember performing. All of the complaints had been dismissed as mental illness rather than investigated seriously. Corinne said she'd located Dr. Marsh's current address, a small apartment in Brooklyn where he'd been living since losing his license. She recommended we take this information to Detective Cole immediately, because if Marsh was drugging and manipulating former patients, it was a serious criminal matter. Grant agreed, and we went back to the precinct with everything Corinne had found. Cole listened to the presentation with growing interest, took copies of all documentation, and said he'd investigate Dr. Marsh immediately. He asked if I'd be willing to wear a wire and confront Marsh to try to get a confession. Grant said absolutely not. That was police work, not civilian work. Cole said fine, they'd handle it officially. The police raided Dr. Marsh's apartment on day 22. They found a laboratory setup in his bedroom with equipment for manufacturing and testing various pharmaceutical compounds. They found detailed files on 12 former patients, including me and Julian, with notes about dosages and effects and planned interventions. They found vials of a custom mixed sedative that combined several prescription drugs to create powerful amnesia and suggestibility. Marsh had been dosing former patients he believed had wronged him, putting them in compromising situations and collecting evidence to use for blackmail or revenge. In my case, he'd lured me to Riverside Park with the note, drugged me with a substance he'd somehow introduced into my apartment, and orchestrated an encounter with Julian, who he'd drugged separately. His goal had been to make us both look guilty of attacking each other, destroying our lives as punishment for perceived slights. Dr. Marsh's notes revealed the full scope of his delusion. He'd documented every patient who he felt had disrespected him or contributed to his loss of license. I was on the list because I'd filed a complaint 8 years ago about him overprescribing anxiety medication. Julian was on the list because he'd refused to provide a positive testimonial during Marsh's license hearing. Marsh had been systematically targeting us and others for years, creating small-scale psychological tortures that looked like mental illness or criminal behavior. The blood on my jacket had been intentional. He'd forced me and Julian into a confrontation while we were both drugged and suggestible, knowing we'd hurt each other, but not remember it. Detective Cole called me personally to apologize for the suspicion I'd been under. He said Marsh was being charged with multiple counts of assault, drugging, kidnapping, and practicing medicine without a license. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including his own detailed documentation of his crimes. Cole said I was no longer a person of interest in any investigation, and my record would reflect that I'd been a victim, not a perpetrator. The relief was enormous but incomplete, because I still had to live with the memory of those 3 weeks of uncertainty, of believing I might be capable of violence I couldn't remember. The toxicology results from Dr. Kowalski came back confirming traces of Marsh's custom sedative in my hair samples. She testified that the compound would cause complete amnesia of events that occurred while under its influence, along with heightened suggestibility and reduced inhibition. She said the drug would be completely undetectable in blood after 48 hours, which explained why Dr. Annan's tests had come back clean. Dr. Kowalski's testimony would be crucial in Marsh's trial, proving he'd drugged victims without their knowledge or consent. I asked Detective Cole how Marsh had accessed my apartment to dose me, and he said they'd found a set of lockpicks and building access codes in Marsh's possession. Apparently, he'd been stalking his targets for months, learning their routines, acquiring access to their homes and workplaces. In my case, he'd entered my apartment while I was at work, laced my coffee maker with the sedative, and planted the note in my jacket pocket. I'd brewed coffee that evening, consumed the drug unknowingly, and followed the note's instructions while in a suggestible state. The entire thing was calculated and cruel and deeply disturbing. I had to tell my mother everything at this point. The investigation was going to be public, Marsh's trial would be in the news, and she'd find out anyway. I called her and asked to meet in person. She came to my apartment and I explained everything from the beginning. The jacket, the blood, the memory gaps, the investigation, the discovery of Marsh's crimes. She listened in silence, her face going through a progression of emotions I could barely watch. When I finished, she asked to see the police report that had officially cleared me. I pulled it up on my laptop and showed her. My mother read through the document, and then something shifted in her expression. She scrolled back to a section about Marsh's patient files and his documented grievances. One entry noted that Marsh had targeted me partially because of a complaint I'd filed, but also because of information provided by a concerned family member about my anxiety and mental health struggles. The family member was listed as my mother. She'd apparently contacted Marsh years ago when she was worried about my stress levels, providing personal information about my life and well-being. Marsh had used that information to build his file on me, to understand my vulnerabilities, to plan his attack. My mother started screaming, not at me, but at herself, at the realization that she'd unknowingly given a predator the tools to hurt me. She'd been trying to help, had reached out to my former doctor out of concern, and had instead fed information to someone who would use it for revenge years later. The guilt and horror in her face was unbearable. I tried to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known, that Marsh was the one responsible for all of this. But she kept saying she should have protected me, should have been more careful, should have never trusted Marsh with personal information about her son. She collapsed then, literally fell to her knees sobbing, and I had to help her to the couch. She was trembling and hyperventilating, and I ended up calling Alicia for help. Between the two of us, we got my mother calm enough to breathe normally, but the damage was done. She'd read the police report and found her own complicity in my nightmare, however unintentional and manipulated. I told her over and over that this was Marsh's doing, that he'd exploited her concern for his own twisted purposes, that she was as much a victim as I was. She eventually stopped crying, but the guilt remained in her eyes. Dr. Marsh's trial happened 4 months later. I testified about my experience, about the jacket and the memory loss, and the weeks of believing I might be a killer. Julian Voss testified about waking up in New Jersey with no memory and defensive wounds he couldn't explain. 8 other victims testified about similar experiences of being drugged and manipulated by Marsh. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the lab equipment, the patient files, the detailed notes, the toxicology reports, the lockpicks and access codes. Marsh's defense tried to argue mental illness, that he'd been traumatized by losing his license and hadn't been thinking rationally. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted him on every count after deliberating for less than 3 hours. Marsh was sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. The judge called his crimes a systematic campaign of psychological torture against vulnerable individuals who had trusted him with their mental health. She said his abuse of medical knowledge to harm rather than heal represented a profound betrayal of professional ethics. She recommended he serve his sentence in a facility equipped to handle prisoners with psychiatric training to prevent him from manipulating other inmates. Watching him led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt something like closure, but not quite satisfaction. He'd stolen weeks of my life, made me doubt my own mind, nearly destroyed my relationship with Alicia and my mother. 32 years seemed both too much and not enough. The aftermath reshaped my understanding of safety and trust. I moved to a new apartment with better security. I installed cameras and changed my locks and became careful about who had access to my space. Alicia and I went to couples therapy to process the trauma of those 3 weeks when she'd been supporting me through an impossible situation. My relationship with my mother took months to repair, long conversations about forgiveness and blame and the ways good intentions could be weaponized by bad people. She eventually accepted that Marsh's crimes weren't her fault, but I could see the guilt still lingered in how carefully she spoke about my well-being. A year later, I was doing better. The nightmares had mostly stopped. I'd changed jobs to get away from the colleagues who knew about the investigation. Alicia and I had moved in together, building something solid from the wreckage of those 3 weeks. My mother visited regularly and had started seeing her own therapist to process her feelings about the situation. We didn't talk about Marsh often, but his shadow was there in the way I checked my coffee before drinking it, in the way I scrutinized any unusual memory gaps, in the way I'd learned that your past could reach out and destroy you through the hands of someone you'd forgotten entirely. The jacket was still in evidence storage somewhere, physical proof of a crime I'd experienced but couldn't remember committing or suffering. Sometimes I thought about requesting its return, having the tangible reminder of what happened. But mostly, I was content to let it stay buried in some police warehouse, along with the version of myself who'd worn it that night. The person I was now had survived something I couldn't fully understand, had learned to live with gaps in my own narrative, had accepted that some questions would never have complete answers. Marsh had tried to destroy me with manufactured evidence and stolen memories. Instead, he'd taught me that the truth was worth fighting for even when it seemed impossibly distant. 21 days from finding blood on my jacket to watching my mother collapse over the police report, and everything that came after. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.